The day my family tried to take my home was the day they finally learned who had been holding their lives together all along. I sat quietly at my dining table while my son Michael, my daughter Jennifer, my younger son Brian, and my sister Linda discussed my future as if I weren't even in the room. They called me lonely, fragile, unable to manage on my own. Then I heard Linda say, "Patsy can't keep living like this. She needs us to make decisions for her." What none of them knew was that for years, every mortgage payment, every emergency bill, every financial rescue they depended on had come from me. And in a few hours, that secret was about to destroy everything they thought they knew. Before we begin, if this story touches your heart in any way, please take a moment to like and subscribe. I always enjoy hearing your thoughts. So tell me in the comments, what would you do if the people you loved underestimated you for years and while you're there? Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. I love seeing how far our stories travel. My name is Patsy Carpenter, and for most of my life, I believed that if you loved your family enough, they would eventually see your heart. At 62 years old, I was beginning to realize how wrong I had been. I lived alone in a white 2-story house on the edge of a small town in Ohio. It wasn't a fancy house. The paint on the porch railings needed touching up. The kitchen cabinets were older than some marriages. The hardwood floors creaked every winter. But it was home. My husband, Robert, and I had built our lives there. Every room carried a memory. The living room still held the spot where Robert used to sit every evening reading the newspaper. The kitchen still smelled faintly like the cinnamon rolls he loved on Sunday mornings. Even after 8 years, I sometimes caught myself expecting to hear his truck pull into the driveway. Grief changes over time. It doesn't disappear. It simply becomes quieter. Most mornings, I woke before sunrise. I made coffee, watered the flowers Robert had planted years ago, and sat on the porch watching the town slowly wake up. To outsiders, my life probably looked lonely. Maybe that's why my children believed I needed saving. Michael, my oldest son, was 40 years old. He lived about 45 minutes away with his wife and 2 boys. When Robert was alive, Michael used to call every week. After Robert passed away, those calls slowly disappeared. At first, it became once a month, then every few months. Eventually, I noticed something painful. Michael only called when he needed something. A favor, advice, help, money, never directly. Of course, there was always a story attached. A problem, an emergency, a situation that wasn't his fault. And somehow, I always found myself helping. Then there was Jennifer. My daughter was 38 and worked as a dental office manager. Jennifer had inherited my stubbornness and her father's charm. Unfortunately, she mostly used that charm when she wanted something. She visited more often than Michael, but rarely because she genuinely wanted to spend time together. There was usually a reason. She needed someone to watch Emily. She needed advice. She needed help with a bill. Or she needed reassurance after another argument with her ex-husband. I loved her deeply, but I couldn't remember the last time she had asked how I was doing and actually waited for the answer. Brian was my youngest. At 35, He still seemed to be searching for stability. One year, he wanted to start a landscaping business. The next year, he wanted to invest in cryptocurrency. The year after that, he was chasing another dream. Brian had a good heart, but he had inherited a dangerous habit. He believed someone would always rescue him, and for years, someone had me. Then there was my sister, Linda Harper. Just thinking about her name still makes my stomach tighten. Linda was 3 years younger than me, but she had always behaved as though she were the older sister. She had opinions about everything, especially me. According to Linda, I was too trusting, too emotional, too generous, too soft. Over the years, those criticisms gradually changed. After Robert died, they became something else, something more insulting. Patsy shouldn't be handling all that paperwork herself. Patsy forgets things sometimes. Patsy shouldn't be alone so much. Patsy isn't as strong as she used to be. At first, I brushed those comments aside. Then I started hearing them more often. From my children. From relatives. From people Linda spoke to. Little seeds planted one conversation at a time. The strange thing was that I wasn't weak. I still drove myself everywhere. I handled my finances. I maintained my home. I volunteered at church. I exercised 3 times a week. My doctor said I was healthier than many women 20 years younger. But once people decide you're old, they stop seeing who you are. They only see what they expect to see. One afternoon, Jennifer stopped by unexpectedly. That alone should have warned me something was wrong. She walked into the kitchen carrying store-bought muffins and an overly cheerful smile. "Mom, you really should let me help more around here." I smiled politely. "Help with what?" She looked around. "The house. The bills. Things like that." I stared at her. "My bills are paid." "Oh, I know." Her smile flickered. "I just mean, things can get overwhelming." There it was. That word. Overwhelming. As though my life was somehow too complicated for me to manage. As though I were hanging on by a thread. I changed the subject. But after she left, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Because something felt different. For months, small comments had been piling up. Questions about my finances. Questions about the house. Questions about whether I had updated my will. Questions about my health. Individually, they seemed harmless. Together, they felt like pieces of a puzzle I couldn't quite see. A week later, Michael called. "Mom, how are you feeling lately?" I nearly laughed. Michael never started conversations that way. "I'm fine." "Good. Good." Then came a long pause. "Have you thought about downsizing?" There it was again. The house. Always the house. I looked around my kitchen. The yellow curtains Robert had chosen. The family photographs covering the walls. The marks on the doorway showing my children's heights as they grew. This house wasn't just property. It was history. "No," I said quietly. "I haven't." Another pause, then disappointment in his voice. Not concern. Disappointment. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked through the house after midnight. The same house where I had raised 3 children. The same house where Robert and I had celebrated anniversaries. The same house where I had held my husband while he took his final breath. I stopped in our bedroom. Robert's photograph sat on the dresser. His smile was exactly as I remembered. Warm. Steady. Safe. I picked up the frame. Maybe I'm imagining things, I whispered. But something doesn't feel right. For a moment, the room was silent. Then a memory surfaced. A conversation from years ago. Robert and I had been sitting on the porch one summer evening. The children were grown. Life felt peaceful. Out of nowhere, Robert had looked at me and said something strange. Promise me something. What? If I'm gone before you, don't spend the rest of your life sacrificing yourself for everyone. I laughed. What are you talking about? But Robert hadn't laughed. His expression had been serious. One day, they'll show you who they really are. I remembered being annoyed. I thought he was being cynical. I thought he was wrong. Standing alone in our bedroom 8 years later, I realized something that frightened me. Maybe Robert hadn't been wrong at all. Maybe he had seen something I refused to see, and maybe whatever was coming had already begun. A few days after, I stood in my bedroom, holding Robert's photograph and wondering whether he had been right all along. Michael called. His voice sounded unusually cheerful. That should have been my first warning. Mom, we're thinking about getting everyone together next Sunday. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table. Everyone? Yeah. Me, Jennifer, Brian, Aunt Linda. Just a family day. A family day. It sounded innocent enough. In truth, I should have been happy. For years, I had wished my children would spend more time together. After Robert died, those gatherings became increasingly rare. Everyone was always busy. Everyone always had an excuse. So, why did my stomach suddenly feel tight? That sounds nice, I said. Great. Jennifer will bring dinner. After we hung up, I stared at the phone. Something about the conversation felt rehearsed, as if Michael had practiced it beforehand. I tried to dismiss the thought. Maybe I was becoming suspicious. Maybe grief and loneliness had made me see problems where none existed. But as the week passed, that uneasy feeling refused to leave. Jennifer called twice. Brian called once. Even Linda called. The sudden attention felt strange, almost coordinated. By Sunday afternoon, my house was filled with people. Jennifer arrived first with trays of food. Brian followed shortly afterward. Michael came with his wife. Linda appeared last, carrying a pie and wearing the expression she always wore when she believed she was the smartest person in the room. For the first hour, everything seemed normal. We ate, we laughed, we shared stories. Emily sat beside me and helped clear dishes. She was 20 years old now, studying nursing at a nearby university. Unlike the rest of the family, Emily actually visited me because she wanted to. Not because she needed something, not because she felt obligated. She simply enjoyed spending time together. I often thought she had inherited Robert's kindness. As dinner ended, the mood slowly shifted. The conversation became more serious, more focused, more deliberate. Linda was the first to steer it. Patsy, have you thought about your future lately? I forced a smile. My future? You know what I mean? Not really, but I had a feeling I was about to find out. Michael leaned forward. We just worry about you. Mom, Jennifer nodded immediately. You're alone here. Brian joined in. This house is a lot for one person. There it was again. The house. Always the house. I kept my expression calm. I manage just fine. Of course you do, Jennifer said quickly. But things change. Linda folded her hands. We're only trying to help. I looked around the table. 4 pairs of eyes watching me. 4 people speaking with one voice. Suddenly, it felt less like a family conversation and more like an intervention. What exactly are you suggesting? I asked. Michael exchanged a glance with Linda. The look lasted only a second, but I noticed it. Jennifer answered. We've been talking about options. Options? For later. The knot in my stomach tightened. What kind of options? Linda smiled. The same smile she used whenever she thought she was being clever. Maybe downsizing. Maybe moving somewhere with more support. Maybe assisted living. The words landed like stones. Assisted living. I nearly laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was absurd. I still drove. I still volunteered. I still maintained my own home. I wasn't sick. I wasn't incapable. Yet they were discussing my future as though I were already halfway gone. Emily looked uncomfortable. I could see it on her face. But she remained quiet. I chose my words carefully. I'm not interested in leaving my home. An awkward silence followed. Jennifer broke it first. We're not saying right now. Michael nodded. Just planning ahead. But something in their faces told me they were disappointed, as though I had given the wrong answer. The conversation eventually moved on, at least on the surface. A few hours later, people began cleaning up. I carried a stack of plates toward the kitchen. Halfway down the hallway, I realized I had forgotten my reading glasses in the living room. I turned back. That's when I heard voices. The kitchen door was partially closed. Nobody knew I was nearby. At first, I only recognized Linda's voice. She's being stubborn. Then Michael. We need to convince her sooner rather than later. My heart stopped. I moved closer. Not enough to be seen. Just enough to hear. Jennifer spoke next. What happens if she refuses completely? Linda answered immediately. Then we'll have to push harder. Silence. Then Brian asked the question that changed everything. What do you think the house is worth now? For a moment, nobody answered. Then Michael said a number. A very large number. Jennifer let out a low whistle. That's more than I expected. My hands started shaking. Linda laughed softly. Exactly. Another pause. Then Michael said something that made my blood run cold. If we sell it, everybody gets breathing room. Everybody. Not Mom. Not Patsy. Everybody. The house wasn't being discussed as my home. It was being discussed as an asset, a payout, a solution to their problems. I stood frozen in the hallway, unable to move, unable to breathe. Then Brian asked, how would we split it? The room became silent, only for a moment. Then they started discussing percentages. Percentages. They were dividing my house before I was even gone. I felt physically sick. Every birthday party, Every Christmas, every family dinner, every memory Robert and I had built within those walls, reduced to numbers, reduced to shares, reduced to money. I wanted to walk into the kitchen. I wanted to confront them. I wanted to scream. Instead, I remained hidden, listening, learning, because suddenly I realized something important. This conversation wasn't new. They were too comfortable, too prepared, too organized. These weren't ideas they had just thought of. This discussion had happened before. Many times. Linda's voice cut through my thoughts. The longer we wait, the harder it becomes. Jennifer sighed. I know. Michael lowered his voice. Then we need a plan. A plan. Not concern. Not care. A plan. At that moment, Emily appeared at the end of the hallway. Our eyes met. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then she saw my face. Whatever expression I was wearing must have told her everything, because her smile vanished instantly. She walked toward me, quietly, without asking questions, without drawing attention. And together, we moved away from the kitchen, back toward the living room. A few minutes later, everyone emerged acting perfectly normal, laughing, smiling, hugging goodbye, pretending nothing had happened. But everything had changed. After the last car disappeared down the street, I sat alone in the dark living room. The silence felt enormous. The grandfather clock ticked steadily from the corner. Tick, tick, tick. I stared at Robert's old armchair, and for the first time in years, I felt truly afraid. Not because I was alone, not because I was growing older, but because I had finally seen something I never wanted to believe. The people I loved most were no longer looking at me. They were looking at what I owned. And somewhere behind all of it, hidden in the shadows, was a plan I still didn't fully understand. A plan that had clearly begun long before I overheard that conversation. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. The morning after the family gathering, I sat alone on my porch with a cup of coffee growing cold in my hands. For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about how to help my children. I was thinking about whether I truly knew them. The question hurt more than I wanted to admit. When you become a mother, your children remain your children, no matter how old they get. You remember scraped knees and school plays. You remember teaching them how to ride bicycles. You remember staying awake through fevers and heartbreaks. You remember the best parts of them. Maybe that's why it's so difficult to see the worst. The phone rang just after 9. I looked at the screen. Daniel Brooks. I hadn't spoken to him in almost 3 months. Good morning, Patsy. His calm voice immediately put me at ease. Morning, Daniel. Everything all right? I almost laughed. Daniel had known me for nearly 15 years. He could always hear what I wasn't saying. I don't know, I admitted. There was a brief silence. Then he said something unexpected. Would you like to come by the office? My eyes narrowed. Why? I think it's time we reviewed a few things. His tone carried meaning beneath the words. I understood immediately. He knew something was wrong. 2 hours later, I was sitting across from him in his office. Daniel Brooks was in his early 60s, with silver hair and the kind of steady presence that made people trust him. After Robert passed away, Daniel had become more than a lawyer. He had become a guardian of promises. Promises my husband had asked me to keep. Daniel opened a folder. A very thick folder. My folder. Years of records. Years of decisions. Years of secrets. As I looked at it, memories began returning. The biggest secret of my life had started 8 years earlier, a month before Robert died. Most people didn't know it. Even our children didn't know it. Robert had built a small manufacturing company long before retirement. Nothing enormous, nothing that made headlines. But he was smart, patient, careful. When he sold his ownership share shortly before his illness worsened, the investment produced far more money than anyone expected. Far more. Enough that neither of us would ever need to worry about finances again. Robert knew he wasn't going to live much longer. The cancer had made that clear. One evening, while sitting in our living room, he made me promise something. Use it wisely. I remember squeezing his hand. We will. He smiled sadly. No, you will. Even then. He knew, after his death, I inherited everything. The investments, the accounts, the assets, the financial security, and because I knew my children struggled, I started helping, quietly. At first, it felt like the right thing to do. Michael had been on the verge of losing his home during a difficult period. His mortgage payments had fallen behind. His pride wouldn't allow him to ask for help. So I called Daniel. A week later, an anonymous financial assistance program paid the overdue amount. Michael never knew it came from me. I remembered the relief in his voice afterward. The strangest thing happened. Mom. I smiled at the memory. Back then, helping felt good. Back then, it felt like love. Daniel slid a document toward me. Michael's file. I looked down. The total made me swallow hard. Over the years, I had helped Michael more than I remembered. Mortgage payments, property tax assistance, emergency repairs, unexpected medical expenses, college savings support for his boys. The total exceeded $200,000. I stared at the number. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Not because of the money, because I genuinely hadn't kept track. I had never viewed those payments as transactions. I viewed them as love. Daniel opened another file. Jennifer, a lump formed in my throat. 5 years earlier, Jennifer had suffered a medical emergency. Her insurance had refused coverage for part of the treatment. The bills nearly destroyed her financially. I still remembered hearing her cry on the phone late one night. She didn't know I was listening. She thought she was alone. The next month, Daniel arranged payment through one of our charitable channels. Jennifer never discovered where the help came from. I remembered her gratitude afterward. I don't know who helped me, she had said. But whoever they are, they saved me. The memory hurt now. Daniel showed me the total. Nearly $180,000. I closed my eyes. Not because I regretted helping, because I suddenly realized how much of my life had revolved around protecting people who never knew I was protecting them. Then came Brian. The most difficult file, the thickest file, the one that nearly broke my heart. Brian had never been irresponsible on purpose. He simply believed tomorrow would somehow fix today's mistakes. It rarely worked. When his landscaping company failed, I helped. When a business partner cheated him, I helped. When debt collectors started calling, I helped. When his apartment lease fell apart, I helped. Every single time. Daniel quietly turned the pages. I watched years of rescue efforts pass before my eyes. The final total exceeded $300,000. I leaned back in my chair. Emotion filled my chest. Not anger. Not yet. Something sadder. The realization that my children had never truly experienced consequences. Because every time life became difficult, an invisible hand had softened the fall. My hand? Daniel closed the folder. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, he said, "You always insisted the assistants remain anonymous." I know. Do you regret that? I thought carefully. The answer surprised me. No, and it was true. I didn't regret helping them. A mother loves because she loves, not because she expects repayment. But another truth had begun taking shape inside me. I regretted allowing them to believe their survival came entirely from their own efforts. Because now they looked at me as though I contributed nothing, as though I were a burden, as though I were weak. The irony was almost unbearable. Daniel opened one final folder, a smaller one. Linda's. I frowned. I don't remember helping Linda much. Daniel raised an eyebrow. You helped her more than once? Then he showed me the records. Small amounts compared to the children, but significant nonetheless. Medical expenses, credit card settlements, debt negotiations, temporary loans. I stared at the pages. Linda, the same woman currently encouraging my children to take control of my life. The same woman questioning my judgment. The same woman who had benefited from my generosity. I suddenly felt exhausted. Daniel noticed. He closed the files. You know why Robert wanted everything structured this way? I nodded. Robert had worried that direct financial support would create dependence. He wanted the help to remain private, temporary, dignified. At the time, I thought he was being overly cautious. Now I wasn't so sure. Daniel, I asked quietly, what would happen if all the assistants stopped? He studied me carefully. The question clearly surprised him. You mean all of it? Yes? His expression became serious. Honestly, he folded his hands. It would be noticed very quickly. I looked away, toward the window, toward the sunlight shining across the parking lot. For years, I had believed I was simply helping. Now I was beginning to wonder if I had become something else. A safety net, an invisible foundation. The person quietly holding everyone together while they assumed they were standing on their own. And perhaps the most painful part was this. None of them knew. Not Michael. Not Jennifer. Not Brian. Not even Linda. They looked at me and saw an aging widow sitting alone in an old house. They never saw the woman carrying their burdens in silence. As I left Daniel's office that afternoon, I couldn't stop thinking about one question. If they discovered the truth tomorrow, would they feel grateful? Or would they simply be angry that the help was no longer there for the first time? I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. 3 days after my meeting with Daniel Brooks, Jennifer called. The moment I heard her voice, I knew something was coming. Not because she sounded nervous, because she sounded too cheerful. "Mom, are you free Friday evening?" I smiled to myself. There it was again. The sudden interest, the sudden invitations, the sudden concern. "I think so." "Good." She paused. "I'm hosting dinner." Another pause. "Everyone's coming." I looked out the kitchen window. The roses Robert had planted years ago were beginning to bloom. Normally, I would have felt happy hearing my family wanted to gather again. Now I felt something entirely different. Suspicion. "That sounds nice." "It'll be fun." Her voice sounded forced, as though she were reading from a script. "Okay," I said. "I'll be there." After we hung up, I sat quietly for several minutes. Then I picked up the phone and called Daniel. "I think it's happening." He didn't ask what I meant. He already knew. "Do you want my advice?" "Yes." "Listen more than you speak." I nodded. That was exactly what I intended to do. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't walking into a family gathering as a mother. I was walking in as an observer. Friday evening arrived. Jennifer's house was brightly lit when I pulled into the driveway. Through the front window, I could already see everyone inside. Michael, Brian, Linda, even Emily. The atmosphere felt strangely formal, like a meeting pretending to be a dinner. Jennifer greeted me at the door with a hug. A very enthusiastic hug. Too enthusiastic. The kind people give when they're trying hard to appear sincere. "Mom, you look wonderful." I smiled politely. "Thank you." The dining table was already set. Everyone seemed unusually attentive. Michael pulled out my chair. Brian offered to carry my purse. Linda complimented my sweater. If I hadn't known better, I might have found it touching. Instead, it made me uneasy, because none of it felt genuine. Dinner began. The conversation stayed light at first. Emily talked about nursing school. Brian complained about gasoline prices. Michael discussed work. Jennifer talked about neighborhood gossip. For nearly an hour, everything seemed normal. Then Linda made her move. She set down her wine glass, folded her hands, and smiled. "Patsy, we've all been talking." I almost laughed. Of course they had. I had already overheard enough to know that, but I kept my expression calm. "Oh." Michael leaned forward. "Mom, we love you." The statement arrived so suddenly it felt rehearsed. Jennifer immediately nodded. "We really do." I noticed Emily glance down at her plate. Even she seemed uncomfortable. Linda continued. And because we love you, we're worried. There it was. The word again. Worried. Always worried. Never specific. Never supported by evidence. Just worried. I took a sip of water. What exactly are you worried about? An awkward silence followed. Apparently, nobody wanted to answer first. Finally, Michael spoke. You're alone. I've been alone for 8 years. That's not what I mean. I waited. Michael exchanged a quick glance with Linda. Then Jennifer joined in. Mom, things become harder as we get older. I almost smiled. Things. Always things. Never anything concrete. Just vague concerns. I decided to help them. What things? Nobody answered immediately. That told me everything. Finally, Linda stepped in. The house. Of course. The house. Always the house. The stairs are dangerous. I nodded thoughtfully. I've managed them for decades. The maintenance is expensive. My bills are paid. The property is too large. I like having space. Each response seemed to frustrate them more, because every argument they presented had an obvious answer. I could practically see their plans slipping away. Then Michael reached into a leather folder. My stomach tightened. There it was. The real reason for the dinner. Paperwork. He placed several documents on the table. The room became noticeably quieter. Jennifer avoided eye contact. Brian suddenly looked fascinated by his napkin. Only Linda appeared comfortable. Michael pushed the papers toward me. We've been discussing ways to make life easier. I looked down. Power of attorney forms. Property management authorization. Financial oversight documents. For a moment, nobody spoke. The silence felt heavy, almost suffocating. Finally, I looked up. What exactly are these? Linda answered before Michael could. Just precautions. Precautions. Such a harmless word. Such a dangerous word. Michael forced a smile. If something ever happened, we'd be able to help. I studied his face. My son. The little boy who once ran into my arms after nightmares. The teenager whose broken heart I comforted after his first serious relationship ended. The young man I had quietly rescued more times than he would ever know. Now sitting across from me asking for control over my life. The realization hurt more than I expected, but I refused to show it. Instead, I picked up the documents, slowly, carefully, pretending to read every page. In reality, I already understood exactly what they wanted. Control, access, influence, authority. Not today, not yet. But eventually, Linda watched me closely, almost eagerly, waiting for me to sign, waiting for me to surrender. I decided to do something unexpected. I pretended confusion. I squinted at the papers, turned pages slowly, asked simple questions. Questions I already knew the answers to. The effect was immediate. Linda's patience began to crack. No, Patsy, that's not the important part. Oh, just look at the signature page. I looked directly at her, for one brief moment, long enough to see irritation flash across her face. Then it disappeared. Interesting. Very interesting. Because irritation wasn't the reaction of someone trying to help. It was the reaction of someone whose plan wasn't moving quickly enough. Emily suddenly spoke. "Grandma doesn't have to sign anything tonight." The room froze. Jennifer looked startled. Linda looked annoyed. Michael forced a smile. "Nobody's pressuring her." The lie hung in the air, visible to everyone, especially Emily. She didn't respond, but I noticed her expression. She was paying attention, watching, learning, just like I was. For another 30 minutes, they continued trying. Different angles, different arguments, different emotional appeals. Every conversation somehow returned to the same destination: the house, the finances, the future. Eventually, I placed the papers back on the table. "I'll think about it." Disappointment spread across multiple faces. Michael tried hiding it. Jennifer looked worried. Linda looked furious. Only Emily appeared relieved. When dinner finally ended, people began gathering their things. I helped carry dishes into the kitchen. As I stood at the sink, I heard Linda speaking quietly in the dining room. I couldn't hear every word, only fragments. "Taking too long." "Need another approach." "She's more stubborn than I expected." I remained silent, listening, thinking, observing, because something had become clear. This wasn't concern. This wasn't family support. This wasn't love. This was strategy. And for the first time, I wasn't playing the role they expected. For years, everyone had assumed Patsy Carpenter was fragile, trusting, easy to influence, easy to guide, easy to manipulate. They still believed that, which gave me an advantage. As I walked to my car later that night, Emily hurried after me. "Grandma?" I turned. She looked nervous, as though she wanted to say something important. Then she glanced back toward the house, toward her mother, toward Linda, toward everyone else. Finally, she whispered, "Please don't sign anything." Our eyes met. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I nodded. "I won't." Relief flooded her face. She hugged me tightly, and as I drove home beneath the dark Ohio sky, one thought kept repeating itself in my mind. They believed they were slowly cornering me. What they didn't realize was that I had finally stopped being blind. And once a person sees the truth, pretending becomes much easier, especially when everyone else still believes you're weak. The Monday after Jennifer's dinner, I woke up feeling strangely calm, not happy, not relieved, just calm. For weeks, I had been living with a growing sense of dread. Every conversation with my family seemed to reveal another uncomfortable truth. But something had changed. For the first time, I wasn't confused anymore. I knew exactly what was happening. The people around me believed I was vulnerable, and they were acting accordingly. There was a certain clarity in that realization. The morning sunlight spilled across my kitchen floor as I poured myself coffee. I had just sat down when I heard a knock at the front door. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened it, I smiled. Emily. My granddaughter stood on the porch holding 2 paper cups and a bakery box. I brought reinforcements. I laughed for the first time in days. Come in. A few minutes later, we were sitting at the kitchen table eating cinnamon rolls. For a while, neither of us mentioned the family dinner. We talked about school, her nursing classes, a professor she disliked, a patient she'd met during clinical training. Normal things, comfortable things. Then Emily set down her coffee cup. Grandma, I looked up. Yes? She hesitated, as though choosing her words carefully. Something isn't right. I appreciated her honesty. Most people spent their lives pretending not to see uncomfortable truths. Emily wasn't one of them. No, I said quietly. It isn't. The room fell silent. Then she asked the question nobody else had asked. Are you okay? The simple kindness nearly broke my heart, because after weeks of conversations about my future, my finances, my house, and my independence, she was the first person who had asked about me. Not my assets, not my property. Me. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. I'm getting there. She nodded. Then she surprised me. I don't trust Aunt Linda. I blinked. The statement was so direct that I almost laughed. What makes you say that? Emily looked uncomfortable. I don't know. Try. She took a deep breath. Every time she talks about you, it sounds like she's discussing a problem. The accuracy of that observation startled me, because it was exactly right. Emily continued. She never talks about what you want. I remained silent. She only talks about what she thinks should happen. I felt a chill run through me. For a 20-year-old, Emily saw far more than most adults. Then she leaned forward. And everyone listens to her. That was true too. Michael listened. Jennifer listened. Brian listened. Over the years, Linda had slowly positioned herself as the family authority, the practical one, the responsible one, the voice of reason. Now I was beginning to wonder how much of that image was real and how much was manipulation. Emily glanced around the kitchen, then lowered her voice. Can I ask you something? Of course. Do you actually need help? I almost smiled. No. Her shoulders relaxed immediately. I didn't think so. Why not? Because you seem more capable than everyone else. The irony of that statement nearly made me laugh. If only the rest of the family saw what Emily saw. The conversation shifted after that. We cleaned the kitchen together. Then Emily helped me organize some old paperwork in my home office. Most people didn't know I kept detailed records. Not because I was suspicious, because Robert had always encouraged good organization. One filing cabinet contained decades of family documents, insurance paperwork, tax records, property information, financial statements. As we worked, Emily accidentally opened the wrong drawer. She froze. I looked over. Inside were folders labeled with family names. Michael, Jennifer, Brian, Linda, and dozens of documents. Her eyes widened. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she looked at me, confused, curious, concerned. Grandma. I slowly closed the drawer. The room became very quiet. This was a moment I had known would eventually come. Just not this soon. Emily sat down across from me. I wasn't snooping. I know. What are those files? I considered my answer carefully. Part of me wanted to continue protecting everyone. Part of me wanted to keep the secret buried. But another part was tired of carrying everything alone. Those files contain records of what? I looked at her. Then I made a decision. Not the whole truth. Just enough. Years ago, after your grandfather passed away, I was fortunate financially. Emily listened carefully. I used some of that money to help family members. Her eyes widened further. How much help? I laughed softly. More than they realize. She didn't speak. So I continued. Sometimes people needed support. Medical bills, debt, emergencies, school expenses. The realization slowly appeared on her face. Wait. She stared at me. Are you saying you've been helping everyone all these years? I nodded. Silence filled the room. The kind of silence that only appears when someone's entire understanding of a situation suddenly changes. Finally, Emily whispered, They don't know. No. None of them. No. She leaned back in her chair, trying to process everything. I could practically see her mind working, connecting pieces, reinterpreting years of family history. Suddenly, many things made sense. Michael's mortgage crisis, Jennifer's medical recovery, Brian's endless financial escapes, the mysterious solutions that had appeared whenever disaster struck, the anonymous assistance, the unexplained rescues. Emily looked stunned. Then something else appeared on her face. Anger. Not at me, at the situation. Grandma, they think you're dependent on them. The statement hung heavily between us. Because it was true. Painfully true. I nodded slowly. Yes. Emily shook her head. They have no idea. No. Again. Silence. Then she asked the question I had been asking myself. Why didn't you tell them? I looked toward the living room, toward the framed photograph of Robert. The answer was complicated, but at its core, it was simple. Because I loved them. Emily frowned. I continued. I didn't want them to feel embarrassed. I didn't want them to feel indebted. I wanted them to keep their dignity. Her expression softened. Then she said something unexpected. Grandma, that's beautiful. I smiled sadly. Maybe. She shook her head. No. Then she paused. Or maybe it's heartbreaking. That answer felt closer to the truth. The afternoon passed quietly after that. But something had changed between us. A deeper trust. A stronger bond. For the first time, someone else knew part of the burden I had carried. Someone else understood. As the sun began to set, Emily gathered her things. Before leaving, she stopped at the front door. "Grandma?" "Yes, if things get worse." She hesitated, then finished softly. "I'm on your side." The words hit me harder than she could possibly know, because for weeks, I had felt increasingly alone, surrounded by family, yet alone. And suddenly, there was one person standing beside me. One person who cared about Patsy Carpenter more than what Patsy Carpenter owned. After she left, I stood at the doorway watching her drive away. Then I returned to the living room. The house felt different somehow. Less lonely, more hopeful. But as I sat down in Robert's old chair, another thought entered my mind. Emily now knew part of the truth, and if she had discovered it by accident, how long would it be before someone else did too? Because secrets have a way of surfacing, especially when the people around them are becoming increasingly desperate. And deep down, I had a feeling desperation was growing inside my family faster than any of them realized. A week after Emily accidentally discovered part of my secret, Michael called. His tone was careful, too careful. The kind of voice people use when they're trying to sound casual while hiding an agenda. "Mom, are you busy tomorrow?" I immediately felt my guard rise. "Why, I need a favor." Of course he did. "What kind of favor?" "It won't take long." He hesitated. "There's a meeting, not lunch, not coffee, a meeting." My instincts immediately told me where this was going. "Who? With a lawyer?" I leaned back in my chair. Interesting. Very interesting. Because there was only one lawyer my family knew. Daniel Brooks. My lawyer. The same man who had spent years helping me protect them. The same man who knew every secret. The irony almost made me smile. "What kind of meeting?" I asked. Michael cleared his throat. "Just some planning." Planning. Another vague word. Another warning sign. I already knew what was happening, but I wanted to see how far they were willing to go. So I agreed. The next afternoon, Michael picked me up. The drive to Daniel's office felt unusually quiet. Normally, Michael filled silence with small talk. Today, he seemed distracted, nervous, as though he were rehearsing something in his head. When we arrived, I wasn't surprised to find Jennifer, Brian, and Linda already waiting. What surprised me was how organized everything appeared. Folders, documents, notes, prepared statements. This wasn't a spontaneous conversation. This was an operation. And judging by the amount of paperwork, it had been planned for quite some time. Daniel greeted everyone professionally. If he felt uncomfortable, he didn't show it. That was one thing I always admired about him. He never revealed more than necessary. We sat around a large conference table. For a few minutes, everyone exchanged polite conversation. Then Linda took control. As usual, she folded her hands and smiled. A smile that never quite reached her eyes. "We're all here because we care about Patsy." The performance had begun. Jennifer nodded. Michael nodded. Brian nodded. I remained silent. Linda continued. "As families get older, difficult decisions become necessary. I noticed Daniel watching carefully, saying nothing, listening, just like I was. We need to make sure Patsy is protected. Protected? There was that word again. I was beginning to hate it. Protected from what? Protected from whom? No one ever explained. The word existed purely to justify control. Linda turned toward Daniel. We've become concerned about her ability to manage things independently. The statement landed like a slap. For a moment, the room seemed to freeze. I looked at my sister. Really looked at her. And suddenly, I saw something I should have noticed years ago. She wasn't concerned. She wasn't worried. She wasn't trying to help. She was building a case. One carefully chosen sentence at a time. Daniel remained calm. What specifically concerns you? Linda seemed prepared, very prepared. She's alone. Daniel nodded. Anything else? She's older. Daniel nodded again. Anything else? Linda hesitated. The pause stretched. Because being older wasn't evidence. Living alone wasn't evidence. Neither proved anything. Finally, Jennifer spoke. Mom forgets things sometimes. I looked at her, slowly, carefully. The look on her face immediately shifted, because she knew. She knew she was exaggerating. Everyone forgets things occasionally, including Jennifer, including Michael, including every human being alive. Daniel remained neutral. What kinds of things? Jennifer stumbled. Small things. Such as another pause. No answer. Because there wasn't one. Brian suddenly joined in. We're just trying to be proactive. The conversation was becoming painful. Not because their arguments were strong. Because they were weak. Desperately weak. And yet they were still willing to use them. Then Linda pushed further. Much further. I think Patsy may need help managing her finances. The room fell silent. Even Michael looked uncomfortable, because that statement crossed a line. And everyone knew it. I felt heat rising inside my chest. Not anger. Humiliation. Pure humiliation. For years, I had quietly protected these people. For years, I had carried burdens they didn't even know existed. And now, I was sitting in a conference room listening to them question whether I could manage my own money. The irony was almost unbearable. Daniel finally looked at me. The first direct question of the meeting. Patsy, would you like to respond? I could have ended everything right there. I could have exposed the truth. I could have opened every file, revealed every payment, destroyed every false assumption. Instead, I chose patience, because Daniel was right. Sometimes, listening reveals more than speaking. I think I'm managing fine. Linda sighed dramatically. That's exactly what worries us. I nearly laughed. There it was, the trap. Any disagreement became evidence. Any independence became a concern. Any confidence became proof of denial. No matter what I said, the conclusion had already been chosen. The meeting continued for another 30 minutes. Every question led back to the same destination. Control, authority, oversight, management, different words. Same objective. Finally, Daniel closed his notebook. I appreciate everyone's concerns. Linda smiled, clearly expecting support. Then Daniel continued. However, I've seen no evidence that Patsy lacks capacity to manage her affairs. The smile vanished instantly. Jennifer looked surprised. Brian looked confused. Michael looked disappointed. Linda looked furious. Daniel wasn't finished. Based on everything I've observed, she appears fully capable of making her own decisions. For the first time all afternoon, nobody had a response. The silence felt glorious. Then Linda attempted one final push. But surely some safeguards, Daniel interrupted politely. Safeguards are appropriate when there's evidence they're needed. Another silence. Another dead end. The meeting was over. Their strategy had failed. As everyone gathered their belongings, I noticed something important. Nobody looked concerned. Nobody looked relieved. Nobody looked happy that I had been declared capable. If their motivation had truly been my well-being, Daniel's assessment should have comforted them. Instead, it frustrated them. That told me everything. Michael offered to drive me home. The ride was even quieter than before. Halfway there, he finally spoke. Mom. Yes. You know we're only trying to help. I stared out the window, at the passing trees, at the Ohio countryside Robert had loved. Then I answered honestly, I hope that's true. The silence that followed lasted the rest of the drive. Later that evening, my phone rang. Daniel. How are you holding up? I sat in Robert's old chair, tired, emotionally exhausted. Honestly, I've never felt more humiliated. His voice softened. You handled yourself well. I shook my head. They treated me like a child. No. He paused. They treated you like an obstacle. The accuracy of that statement stunned me, because it captured exactly what I had been feeling. Not a mother, not a sister, not family. An obstacle, something standing between them and what they wanted. Daniel spoke again. There's something else. My stomach tightened. What? I think they're becoming impatient. I already suspected that. The failed dinner, the failed paperwork, the failed meeting. Every setback increased pressure, and desperate people rarely become more reasonable. They become more dangerous. After we ended the call, I sat alone in the darkness. The house was quiet, peaceful, safe. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was coming. Because today's meeting hadn't ended the situation. It had escalated it. Linda's frustration had been impossible to miss. And frustrated people make mistakes, especially when greed begins overpowering caution. For the first time, I found myself wondering not whether my family would push harder, but how far they were willing to go. And deep in my heart, a frightening answer was beginning to form, farther than I ever imagined. The day after the meeting at Daniel's office, I couldn't stop thinking about Robert. His words kept replaying in my mind. One day, they'll show you who they really are. For years, I had resisted that possibility. Not because I thought Robert was wrong, because I desperately wanted him to be wrong. A mother wants to believe the best about her children, even when the evidence says otherwise. Especially when the evidence says otherwise. That evening, after dinner, I found myself wandering through the house. The sun was setting outside. Long shadows stretched across the hardwood floors. The rooms felt unusually quiet, not lonely, reflective, as though the house itself was inviting me to remember. I walked upstairs, past the bedrooms, past the family photographs lining the hallway, past decades of memories frozen in frames. At the end of the hall was a small storage room. Most people would call it an attic. Robert called it our time capsule. Inside were dozens of boxes, old photo albums, holiday decorations, letters, keepsakes, pieces of a life we had built together. I hadn't opened most of them in years. Slowly, I switched on the light. Dust floated through the air. The room smelled faintly of old paper and cedar wood. I wasn't looking for anything specific, at least not consciously. Yet somehow, I found myself standing in front of a particular box. One labeled Robert, personal. My chest tightened. I carefully lifted it down. The box felt heavier than I remembered. Inside were journals, old notebooks, business documents, birthday cards, and near the bottom, a sealed envelope. My name was written on the front, Patsy, in Robert's handwriting. For a moment, I simply stared at it. I knew the letter. I had read it once, years ago, shortly after his death. But grief had made everything blurry back then. Perhaps I hadn't truly heard what he was trying to tell me. With trembling fingers, I opened the envelope. The paper had yellowed slightly with age. The first line immediately brought tears to my eyes. My sweet Patsy, if you're reading this, then I'm no longer sitting beside you arguing about what movie to watch on Friday nights. I laughed softly through my tears. That sounded exactly like Robert. Even in death, he knew how to make me smile. I continued reading. The letter wasn't about money. It wasn't about business. It wasn't about his illness. It was about me, about the life he hoped I would continue living after he was gone. Halfway through the letter, I reached a paragraph that stopped me cold. You have the kindest heart of anyone I've ever known. That's one of the reasons I fell in love with you. But it's also the thing that worries me most. My eyes filled with tears. Because Robert knew me better than anyone ever had. I kept reading. You will always choose sacrifice before self-protection. You'll always choose forgiveness before boundaries. And you'll always convince yourself that giving more love will solve problems that love alone cannot fix. I lowered the letter. My hands were shaking because every word was true. Every single word. For years after Robert died, I had done exactly that. Given more, sacrificed more, excused more, protected more. Even when nobody asked. Even when nobody appreciated it. Even when it hurt me. I forced myself to continue reading. One day, there may come a moment when the people you love stop seeing your generosity as a gift and start seeing it as an obligation. If that happens, remember something important. You are not responsible for saving everyone. The room felt suddenly smaller, the silence heavier, because deep inside, I knew exactly why those words affected me. They described my life perfectly. For years, I had been carrying responsibilities that belonged to other adults. Mortgage problems, debt problems, medical emergencies, poor decisions, financial mistakes. I had quietly stepped in every time, not because anyone forced me, because I couldn't bear to watch my children suffer. But somewhere along the way, helping had become expected, invisible, normal. The final section of the letter nearly broke me. Love them, support them, pray for them, but never destroy yourself trying to rescue people who refuse to stand on their own. You deserve peace too. I love you forever, Robert. For several minutes, I simply sat there, the letter resting in my lap, tears sliding down my face. Not tears of sadness, not entirely. Something else. Recognition, truth, understanding. Robert hadn't been warning me about my children. He had been warning me about myself, about my inability to stop sacrificing, about my tendency to confuse love with endless giving. And suddenly, I understood something I had never understood before. The problem wasn't just what my family was doing. The problem was what I had allowed. I had spent years protecting everyone from consequences, years shielding them from hardship, years solving problems they should have learned to solve themselves, not because they demanded it, because I offered it, because it made me feel useful, needed, connected. The realization hurt, but it also felt strangely freeing. For the first time, I wasn't focused on what my family had done wrong. I was focused on what I needed to change. That night, I barely slept. I sat in Robert's old recliner until nearly 3 a.m, thinking, remembering, questioning, and eventually deciding. By sunrise, I knew what I had to do. The decision terrified me, but it also felt necessary. At 9 o'clock, I called Daniel. He answered immediately. Good morning, Patsy. I've made a decision. His voice became serious. I'm listening. I stared out the window, at the garden Robert had planted, at the life we had built, at the future I needed to protect. I want to stop all support. Silence. Not shocked silence. Thoughtful silence. Finally, Daniel spoke. Are you sure? No. That answer surprised both of us. I laughed softly. No, I'm not sure. But I think it's time. Another pause. Then Daniel asked the most important question. Why now? I looked down at Robert's letter, still resting on my lap. Because I've finally realized I'm not helping them anymore. My voice cracked slightly. I'm preventing them from growing. Daniel remained quiet, allowing me to continue. I thought I was protecting my family. I swallowed hard. But maybe I've been protecting them from reality. The words felt heavy, painful, necessary. Daniel spoke carefully. If we stop everything, they'll notice. I know. And they won't know why. I know. They may become angry. I closed my eyes. thinking about Michael, Jennifer, Brian, Linda, the storm that was likely coming. I know. The room fell silent again. Then Daniel asked one final question. When would you like the changes to begin? I looked at Robert's letter one last time. The final gift from the man who had always told me the truth, even when I didn't want to hear it. Then I took a deep breath. Immediately, as soon as the words left my mouth, a strange feeling washed over me. Fear, relief, grief, freedom, all at once. Because after years of quietly holding everyone together, I had finally chosen to let go. And deep down, I knew something important. The moment those invisible supports disappeared, everything hidden beneath the surface would finally be revealed, including the people my family had truly become. The first sign appeared 11 days after I told Daniel to stop everything. Not a dramatic sign, not some explosive confrontation, just a phone call. Michael called on a Tuesday morning. His voice sounded strained. Tough week. I asked the question casually. There was a long pause. Yeah. I sat quietly in my kitchen, waiting, listening. For years, I would have immediately offered help. Now I simply let him talk. The boys needed some school expenses. Another pause. And the roof repair ended up costing more than expected. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. I'm sorry to hear that. Silence. More silence. He was waiting for me to ask questions, waiting for me to offer something. When I didn't, he sounded disappointed. Well, I guess we'll figure it out. That's usually how people do it. The response slipped out before I could stop it. Michael laughed awkwardly, then changed the subject. After we hung up, I stared at my coffee cup. For years, that conversation would have ended differently, very differently, and we both knew it. 3 days later, Jennifer called. The moment I answered, I could hear frustration in her voice. Mom, have you ever had insurance suddenly refuse something? My heart sank, not because I didn't care, because I knew exactly what was happening. The invisible support system was gone, and reality was arriving. What happened? She sighed. There's a treatment my doctor recommended. I listened quietly. The insurance company won't cover all of it. My chest tightened. The old instinct immediately surfaced. Help her. Fix it. Protect her. The same instinct that had controlled me for years. But Robert's letter echoed in my mind. You are not responsible for saving everyone. I took a deep breath. I'm sorry. Sweetheart. Another pause. Then Jennifer said something unexpected. I don't know why things suddenly feel harder. I almost answered. Almost. But I stopped myself. Because she wasn't asking the right question. The question wasn't why things felt harder. The question was why things had felt easier for so long. And she didn't know the answer. A week later, Brian showed up at my house. Unannounced. That wasn't unusual. The expression on his face was, he looked exhausted, worried, frustrated. The moment he sat down, I knew Something had gone wrong. My business partner backed out. I nodded. I'm sorry. Brian rubbed his face. We had investors lined up. More bad news. More problems. More pressure. Exactly the kind of situation that had always triggered one of my silent rescues. But this time, there would be no rescue. Brian stared at the floor, then said something that broke my heart. I feel like everything keeps falling apart lately. The words weren't manipulative. They were honest. Painfully honest. For a moment, I almost told him everything. Almost. But I didn't, because the truth wouldn't help him yet. What he needed wasn't another bailout. What he needed was resilience, the ability to survive disappointment without someone secretly fixing it. We talked for nearly an hour. When he left, I stood on the porch watching him drive away. Tears filled my eyes. Not because I regretted my decision, because growth is painful, and watching people you love struggle is one of the hardest things in the world. Even when it's necessary. Over the next few weeks, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Michael called more frequently. Jennifer seemed increasingly stressed. Brian looked constantly worried. And then something unexpected happened. Linda started calling too. At first, the conversation seemed innocent. Then I noticed a pattern. Questions. Lots of questions. Have you spoken to Michael lately? How's Jennifer doing? Has Brian mentioned anything? Eventually, I realized what she was doing. She was gathering information, trying to understand why everyone suddenly seemed to be struggling. One afternoon, she came to visit. The moment she walked into my kitchen, I could tell she was agitated. Her smile looked forced. Her movements seemed tense. After 20 minutes of small talk, she finally got to the point. Something strange is happening. I pretended confusion. Oh, everyone's having money problems. I stirred my tea. That happens. No. She shook her head. This is different. I remained silent. Linda leaned forward, almost whispering. It's like some source of support disappeared. For a moment, I thought my heart might stop, because she was closer to the truth than anyone else. Not close enough, but closer. I carefully kept my expression neutral. What kind of support? She frowned. I don't know. The frustration in her voice was obvious. And suddenly, I realized something. Linda was struggling too. Not just emotionally, financially. The knowledge startled me. Then I remembered Daniel's file. The debts. The settlements. The assistance. All those years of quiet support. Linda had benefited from it as well. Not nearly as much as the children. But enough. Enough to notice when it vanished. Enough to panic. As the weeks passed, the pressure continued building. And with pressure came cracks. The first crack appeared during a Sunday dinner at Jennifer's house. I wasn't supposed to hear the argument, but I arrived early. The front door was slightly open. Voices carried from inside. Michael sounded angry. You said things would be easier after we handled Mom. My blood froze. Handled Mom. Not helped. Handled. Jennifer sounded frustrated. Keep your voice down. Then Linda. I'm telling you, something changed. A long silence followed. Then Brian spoke. What if we're wrong? Nobody answered immediately. That caught my attention. Because for the first time, uncertainty had entered the conversation. Not everyone was convinced anymore. Not everyone was following Linda blindly. Then Michael spoke again. "What are you saying?" Brian hesitated, then answered quietly. "What if Mom isn't the problem?" The room became silent, completely silent. I stood frozen outside the doorway, heart pounding, because that single sentence represented the first crack in their assumptions. The first moment someone questioned the narrative. The first moment someone considered another possibility. A few seconds later, I deliberately knocked. The conversation ended instantly. When Jennifer opened the door, everyone looked uncomfortable, nervous, guilty. I smiled politely, as though I hadn't heard a thing. But inside, something had shifted, because the invisible foundation beneath their lives was gone now. The money, the protection, the safety net, all of it. And slowly, they were beginning to notice. Not the source. Not yet. Just the absence. The strange emptiness where help had once appeared. The unexplained disappearance of solutions, and desperation was growing. I could see it in every conversation, every glance, every argument, especially in Linda. Because more than anyone else, Linda seemed determined to find answers. Determined to regain control. Determined to understand why her carefully organized plan was beginning to unravel. What she didn't realize was that the unraveling had only just begun. And very soon, someone would ask the question none of them had thought to ask before. Where had all that help been coming from when that question finally surfaced? Everything would change. By the middle of October, the pressure inside my family had become impossible to ignore. It showed up in tired faces, short tempers, missed payments, unanswered questions, and most of all, fear. Fear has a way of exposing people. When life is comfortable, almost anyone can appear kind, patient, reasonable. But when comfort disappears, character reveals itself. I was beginning to see everyone's character more clearly than ever before, including my own. The confrontation happened on a rainy Thursday afternoon. I had just returned home from grocery shopping when I noticed 3 vehicles parked outside my house. Michael's truck, Jennifer's SUV, Brian's sedan. My stomach immediately tightened, because I knew whatever was about to happen had been planned. Again. The front door opened before I even reached the porch. Linda stepped outside. That alone told me everything. Whenever Linda appeared first, trouble followed. "We need to talk." Not hello, not how are you, just business. I set down my grocery bags. "About what?" Michael appeared behind her, then Jennifer, then Brian. All of them looked tense. The sight broke my heart, not because they were angry, because they looked desperate. And desperate people often do things they later regret. I quietly carried my groceries inside. They followed, one by one, like a committee entering a board meeting. The moment we sat down in the living room, I noticed something else. Emily was there too, but unlike everyone else, she looked uncomfortable, almost anxious. She sat silently in the corner, watching, observing. Her phone rested on her lap. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Later, I would understand exactly why it was there. Michael spoke first. "Mom, We're worried. The familiar phrase almost made me smile. Always worried. Never honest. Never direct. I folded my hands calmly. What are you worried about? Jennifer exchanged a glance with Linda, then answered. Things are getting difficult. I nodded. They are. The room fell silent. That wasn't the response they expected. Linda stepped in. People need help. There it was. Finally. Not concern for me. Concern for themselves. I leaned back slightly. People usually do. Her jaw tightened. Michael rubbed his forehead. Then he said something that surprised me. We don't understand what's happening. For the first time, his frustration sounded genuine. Not manipulative, not strategic, just confused. And in a strange way, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Brian spoke next. It's like everything is falling apart at once. Jennifer nodded immediately. My bills keep piling up. Michael added his own problems. The roof repairs, the mortgage pressure, unexpected expenses, one after another, the stories poured out. And for a moment, I simply listened. Years ago, those same stories would have triggered an immediate response. I would have called Daniel, written checks, arranged transfers, solved problems. But now, I understood something important. Every problem they described belonged to them, not me. The distinction felt painful, but necessary. Then Linda finally lost patience. None of this would be happening if we had already taken care of your situation. The room went silent. Even Michael looked shocked. Jennifer stared at the floor. Brian looked uncomfortable because Linda had just said the quiet part out loud. My situation, not our situation, not family problems. My situation, the obstacle, the barrier, the thing standing in the way. I slowly turned toward her. What exactly is my situation? For the first time all afternoon, Linda hesitated. Then her frustration exploded. This house! There it was. At last. No disguises. No careful wording. No fake concern. Just the truth. This house is worth a fortune. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody denied it. Linda continued. If you just do the sensible thing, Michael interrupted. Aunt Linda? But she was already too angry to stop. You don't need all this space. You don't need all this money. You don't need to keep holding on to the past. Every sentence landed harder than the last, because none of it was about my well-being. Every word was about what she wanted. Then came the sentence that changed everything. You've become selfish. The room froze. Completely froze. I stared at my sister, the woman whose debts I had quietly helped settle, the woman whose financial mistakes I had secretly cushioned, the woman currently sitting in my home calling me selfish. Something inside me shifted. Not anger. Not hatred. Something calmer. Something stronger. Acceptance. For the first time, I stopped making excuses for her. Michael stood up. Aunt Linda, enough! But she ignored him. Years of frustration poured out. We're all struggling. We're all trying to survive. And you're sitting on assets that could solve everything. The irony was breathtaking, because she had no idea how many times those assets had already solved everything. No idea how many years she had benefited from them. No idea how many disasters had quietly disappeared because of me. And still, she called me selfish. Jennifer suddenly began crying. Not dramatic tears, real tears, exhausted tears. I don't know what to do anymore. The room softened slightly. Because Jennifer wasn't angry. She was scared. For the first time, I truly saw it. The support system had vanished, and she was drowning. Brian looked equally defeated. Michael looked older than I remembered. The pressure was affecting all of them. Then Emily finally spoke. Her voice was calm, but firm. You're blaming the wrong person. Everyone turned toward her. Linda frowned. What does that mean? Emily looked directly at her. You keep acting like Grandma caused your problems. Nobody answered. Because deep down, they knew she was right. Emily continued. Grandma didn't create your debt. Grandma didn't make your financial decisions. Grandma isn't responsible for fixing everything. The silence grew heavier. Then Linda laughed bitterly. You're young. You don't understand. Emily's expression hardened. No. She looked around the room, at her mother, at her uncles, at Linda, then finally at me. I understand more than you think. Something about her tone caught my attention. A warning, a clue, a promise. And suddenly, I noticed her phone again, still resting on her lap. Screen facing upward. Recording. My heart skipped a beat. She had been recording the entire conversation. Every accusation, every confession, every cruel word. Emily wasn't just protecting me. She was preserving the truth. The realization filled me with both relief and sadness. Relief because someone was paying attention. Sadness because it had become necessary. The argument continued for another hour. Voices rose. Emotions exploded. Old resentment surfaced. And throughout it all, I remained calm, listening, watching, learning, because every word confirmed what I already suspected. The desperation was growing. The pressure was building, and the cracks inside the family were spreading. Eventually, everyone left. One by one. Michael looked ashamed. Jennifer looked heartbroken. Brian looked exhausted. Linda looked furious. Only Emily stayed behind. After the others disappeared down the driveway, she sat beside me. Neither of us spoke for several moments. Then she quietly held up her phone. I got everything. I stared at her. Everything? She nodded. Every accusation, every demand, every word, safely recorded, safely preserved, evidence, not because we planned to use it, because someday we might need it. And deep down, both of us knew that day was getting closer, much closer, because the storm inside this family was far from over. In fact, It was only beginning to reach its most dangerous stage. And very soon, the truth everyone had spent years ignoring would finally come crashing into the open. The week after the confrontation at my house was strangely quiet. Too quiet. No angry phone calls, no surprise visits, no new attempts to pressure me. At first, I thought perhaps everyone was finally reflecting on what had happened. Then Daniel called. "Patsy." The seriousness in his voice immediately caught my attention. "What is it?" "I think it's time." I looked out my kitchen window. The autumn leaves were falling steadily now. Orange and gold covered the yard Robert had once spent hours maintaining. Time for what? The truth. I closed my eyes. Part of me had known this moment was coming. For months, tension had been building. Questions had multiplied. Masks had started slipping. The family was becoming increasingly desperate, and desperation rarely disappears on its own. "Are you sure?" Daniel didn't hesitate. Yes. I sat quietly. My heart felt heavy. Not because I feared the truth, because I knew what it would do. Once certain things are revealed, families can never return to the way they were before. But perhaps ours had already crossed that point. Perhaps there was nothing left to preserve except honesty. "When?" I finally asked. Daniel answered immediately. "This Saturday." Saturday. 3 days away. Enough time to prepare. Not enough time to avoid it. After we hung up, I sat alone for nearly an hour, thinking, praying, remembering. I wasn't afraid of losing money. I wasn't afraid of losing property. What frightened me was losing the illusion that my family truly saw me. Because deep down, some part of me still hoped I was wrong. Still hoped there was an explanation. Still hoped they would surprise me. Saturday arrived cold and gray. The kind of Ohio afternoon that makes everything feel heavier. Daniel had arranged the meeting in a private conference room at his office. Neutral ground. No one could claim favoritism. No one could storm out of my house. No one could hide behind familiar surroundings. When I arrived, Daniel was already there. Several large envelopes rested neatly on the table. My stomach tightened. Those envelopes contained years of secrets, years of sacrifices, years of invisible support, the evidence of a life nobody had bothered to see. One by one, everyone arrived. Michael, Jennifer, Brian, Linda, Emily. The atmosphere felt tense from the beginning. No one seemed sure why they had been invited. No one seemed comfortable, especially Linda. She looked nervous. That alone interested me, because Linda rarely looked nervous. She preferred being the person who made others uncomfortable. Today felt different. Daniel waited until everyone was seated. Then he began. "Thank you for coming." Nobody responded. The silence stretched. Finally, Michael asked the obvious question. "What is this about?" Daniel folded his hands, then looked directly at me. I nodded, the signal we had agreed upon. "Go ahead." The room became still. Daniel turned back toward the others. "For several years, many assumptions have been made regarding Patsy. Nobody spoke. Daniel continued. Today, we're going to discuss facts. Something in his tone caused immediate unease. Jennifer shifted in her chair. Brian looked confused. Linda crossed her arms. Then Daniel pushed the envelopes forward, one toward each person. Please, open them. Nobody moved at first. Then Michael opened his. Jennifer followed. Brian hesitated before doing the same. Linda looked annoyed, but eventually complied. The room remained silent as papers emerged. Page after page, document after document, record after record. Then the expressions started changing. First confusion, then surprise, then disbelief. Michael frowned deeply. Jennifer's eyes widened. Brian looked completely lost. Finally, Michael spoke. What is this? Daniel answered calmly. A complete record of financial assistance provided to you over the years. The room froze. Jennifer looked down again, then back up, then down once more, as though her brain couldn't process what she was seeing. Michael flipped pages faster. His face became paler with every sheet. Brian stared silently. Then Linda laughed nervously. This has to be some mistake. Daniel didn't even look at her. It isn't. I watched quietly, saying nothing, because for once, I wasn't the one carrying the burden of truth. They were. Michael suddenly stopped turning pages. His eyes locked onto a particular document. His face drained of color. No. The word barely escaped his lips. Daniel nodded toward the paper. Please read the date. Michael swallowed. His hands trembled. 8 years ago. The year after Robert died. The year Michael nearly lost his home. I remembered every detail, every phone call, every sleepless night, every tear he thought nobody saw. Daniel spoke softly. The mortgage assistance came from Patsy. Michael stared at me, not speaking, not blinking, as though seeing me for the first time. Jennifer looked up sharply. What? Daniel turned toward her. The medical expenses from your emergency treatment. Jennifer's face went pale. No. They were paid through a charitable trust funded by Patsy. Tears immediately filled her eyes. I watched her shoulders begin to shake. The memory clearly hit her. The fear, the uncertainty, the relief she had felt when help mysteriously appeared. All those years, she believed a stranger had saved her. Now learning it had been her mother. Brian was next. His file was the thickest. The room became increasingly silent as Daniel reviewed the records. Failed business ventures, debt settlements, emergency assistance, lease support, loan restructuring, page after page, year after year, rescue after rescue. Brian eventually lowered his head. His eyes were red. His voice barely audible. All of this. Daniel nodded. All of it. No one spoke. The silence felt enormous. Then Michael asked the question everyone was thinking. Why? The single word echoed through the room. Why? Why hide it? Why never say anything? Why help so much? Why carry everything alone? I finally spoke. The first time all afternoon. Because I loved you. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. I continued quietly. You were struggling. You were hurting. And I could help. Jennifer started crying openly now. Real tears. The kind that come from shame rather than sadness. Michael looked sick. Brian stared at the floor. Then came the biggest revelation. Daniel turned toward Linda and slid another document across the table. Her face changed instantly. She recognized it. Immediately. I saw the fear before she could hide it. Daniel's voice remained calm. You received assistance as well. Linda's jaw tightened. Not much. The answer came too quickly, too defensively. Daniel opened the file. Medical debt. Another page. Credit card settlement. Another page. Financial intervention during a collection action. Another page. Additional private assistance. Linda's face had gone completely pale. The room shifted. The focus shifted. Everyone noticed. Because unlike the others, Linda wasn't emotional. She was frightened. Very frightened. Michael looked toward her, then toward the documents, then back again. A realization was beginning to form. A dangerous realization. Because one fact had become impossible to ignore. The person who had spent months claiming Patsy was a burden had secretly benefited from Patsy's generosity too. The irony hung heavily in the room. Nobody knew what to say. Nobody knew where to look. And for the first time since this nightmare began, the balance of power had completely changed. Not because I had attacked anyone, not because I had defended myself, simply because the truth had entered the room. And truth has a way of making every lie collapse under its own weight. As the silence continued, I realized something important. The shock wasn't over. Not even close. Because these documents explained who had been helping, but they didn't explain why Linda had worked so hard to take control. That secret was still hidden. For now. And judging by the fear on Linda's face, she knew exactly what was coming next. For several long seconds after Daniel revealed Linda's financial records, nobody spoke. The room felt frozen. Michael stared at his papers. Jennifer's eyes remained red from crying. Brian looked overwhelmed. And Linda looked trapped. It was the first time I had ever seen genuine fear on her face. Not embarrassment, not irritation. Fear. The difference mattered, because embarrassed people worry about what others think. Frightened people worry about what others might discover. And judging by Linda's expression, there was still something she desperately wanted hidden. Daniel seemed to notice it too. He calmly closed one folder and opened another. A thinner folder. One I had never seen before. Immediately, Linda sat upright. Her reaction was subtle, but noticeable. Daniel looked directly at her. There's one more matter we need to discuss. My sister's face turned pale. What matter? For the first time all afternoon, Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he carefully removed several documents. The room grew even quieter. Michael looked confused. Jennifer wiped her eyes. Brian frowned. Emily sat silently beside me, watching everything. Daniel finally spoke. Over the past year, a number of claims were made regarding Patsy's mental capacity. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. I felt my pulse quicken, because suddenly I knew where this was going. Linda spoke quickly. People were concerned. Daniel looked at her. People? Linda hesitated, then nodded. Yes. Daniel slid one document across the table. Toward Michael. Another toward Jennifer. Another toward Brian. The three siblings looked down simultaneously, and their expressions immediately changed. What is this? Michael asked. Daniel answered calmly. A written recommendation. Michael read silently. Then his eyes widened. Jennifer leaned closer. Brian looked over his shoulder. The room became still again. Because the document wasn't a recommendation. It was a statement. A statement claiming concerns about my ability to manage finances. A statement suggesting I might require supervision. A statement encouraging further evaluation. A statement signed by Linda Harper, my own sister. Jennifer looked horrified. You wrote this. Linda immediately became defensive. It wasn't like that. Daniel opened another folder. Actually, it was exactly like that. Inside were emails, letters, correspondence. Months of correspondence, and every page pointed in the same direction. Linda had been building a narrative, quietly, carefully, methodically. The realization spread across the room like wildfire. Michael looked stunned. Brian looked angry. Jennifer looked betrayed. I simply felt tired. Deeply tired. Because suddenly, dozens of strange moments from the past year began making sense. The comments, the questions, the rumors, the concern, the repeated suggestions that I wasn't capable anymore. They hadn't appeared naturally. Someone had planted them. Someone had nurtured them. Someone had encouraged them to grow. And that someone was sitting directly across from me. Linda's voice became sharper. You don't understand. Michael turned toward her. No. His voice was unusually cold. I think we do. That was the first time I had ever heard Michael speak to Linda that way, and she noticed. Her confidence immediately weakened. Daniel continued. Unfortunately, there's more. The room seemed to shrink, because everyone knew what those words meant. More evidence. More secrets. More truth. Daniel removed another document. Then another. Then another. Each one connected to the same issue. Attempts to obtain medical information. Requests for assessments. Communications with third parties. Questions regarding competency evaluations. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Linda hadn't merely worried about me. She had actively tried to create evidence that I was incapable. The realization hit everyone at once. Jennifer covered her mouth. Brian stared in disbelief. Michael slowly shook his head. Why? The question hung heavily in the air. Why? Why do this? Why target your own sister? Why manipulate your own family? Why spend months pushing this narrative? For a moment, Linda didn't answer. Then she looked directly at me, and I saw something unexpected. Not hatred, not greed. Desperation. Pure desperation. Her shoulders slumped. The fight drained out of her, and suddenly she looked older than I had ever seen her. Daniel quietly placed one final document on the table. No one touched it. No one needed to. The title alone explained everything. Outstanding debt summary. The room became silent. Michael slowly reached for it. His eyes scanned the first page, then the second, then the third. His face turned white. Jennifer looked over his shoulder. She gasped. Brian grabbed the document next. Within seconds, everyone understood. Linda wasn't struggling financially. Linda was drowning financially. The amount was staggering. Years of poor decisions, failed investments, credit card debt, personal loans, hidden obligations, collection actions. Everything combined into a disaster. The truth finally stood exposed. Linda wasn't trying to protect me. She was trying to save herself. The room remained completely silent. Then Jennifer whispered, "Oh my God." Nobody disagreed, because the scale of it was unbelievable. Linda looked away, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Michael finally spoke. "Is this why?" She didn't answer. He repeated the question, more firmly. "Is this why you've been pushing Mom to sell the house?" Silence. Then tears appeared in Linda's eyes. For the first time all day, real tears. Not performance, not manipulation. Actual tears. And then she nodded. Just once. The room seemed to exhale simultaneously, because at last, the final piece had fallen into place. Everything suddenly made sense. The pressure, the urgency, the manipulation, the constant focus on my house, the attempts to question my competence, the family meetings, the paperwork, the legal discussions, all of it. Every single piece. It had never been about me. It had been about Linda's debt. Linda finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know what else to do." Jennifer stared at her. "So, you lied." Linda closed her eyes. "I panicked." Michael stood up. The disappointment on his face was devastating. "You made us believe Mom couldn't take care of herself." Linda started crying harder. "I was trying to fix things." Brian laughed bitterly. "No." His voice shook. "You were trying to take her house." The bluntness of the statement shocked everyone, mostly because it was true. And truth is hardest to hear when it arrives without softening. For several minutes, nobody spoke. The room felt emotionally exhausted, as though years of tension had finally exploded and left everyone drained. Then something unexpected happened. Emily quietly reached into her bag and placed her phone on the table. Everyone looked at her. She took a deep breath. "I think you should hear something." My heart skipped. The recording, the one from my living room, the one she had secretly captured. Suddenly, Linda's face lost all remaining color. Because she knew. She knew exactly what was on that recording. And she knew everyone was about to hear it. The cruel words, the pressure, the manipulation, the truth. For the first time since this nightmare began, Linda looked completely defeated, and as Emily prepared to press play, I realized something important. The revelations weren't over. Not yet. The documents had exposed the motive, but the recording would expose the behavior, the lies, the cruelty, the manipulation, everything. And once everyone heard it, there would be no hiding behind excuses anymore. None at all. The moment Emily pressed play, the room filled with silence. Not because the recording had started, because everyone knew what was coming. Nobody reached for a phone. Nobody spoke. Nobody looked away. The first voices emerged from the speaker. Michael, Jennifer, Brian, Linda, and finally mine. The recording was crystal clear. Every word, every accusation, every cruel implication, every attempt to pressure me. At first, the room remained motionless. Everyone listened. Then Linda's voice echoed through the speakers. "This house is worth a fortune." Nobody reacted. Not outwardly, but I watched Michael's jaw tighten. Jennifer lowered her eyes. Brian folded his arms. The recording continued, one statement after another, one uncomfortable truth after another. Then came the sentence that changed everything. "You don't need all this money." The room became painfully still, because hearing those words spoken aloud was different than remembering them. There was no context now, no explanation, no excuse, just naked greed, raw and undeniable. Jennifer began crying again, this time harder, because she wasn't just hearing Linda. She was hearing herself, hearing the moments she stayed silent, hearing the moments she allowed things to happen, hearing the moments she chose convenience over courage. The recording reached its end. The final words faded. Then silence returned. A long silence. The kind that forces people to confront themselves. No one rushed to speak. No one rushed to defend themselves. For once, there was nowhere to hide. Finally, Michael stood. He walked to the window, turned his back to the room, and remained there for nearly a minute. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded different, older, heavier, ashamed. "I can't believe this." Nobody answered, because there was nothing to say. The evidence had spoken for itself. Jennifer wiped her eyes, then looked directly at me. Not at the papers, not at Daniel, at me, her mother, the woman she had failed. "I'm sorry." The words came out broken, barely audible, but they were real. The first genuine apology anyone had offered. Not an excuse, not a justification, not a defense, just sorrow. My heart ached, because despite everything, she was still my daughter, and seeing her hurt never became easy. Brian leaned forward. His hands shook slightly. "I thought we were helping." No one answered immediately. Then he lowered his head. "No." He swallowed hard. "That's not true." The honesty surprised me. He continued. "I knew something felt wrong." His eyes filled with tears. But I ignored it. For the first time since this nightmare began, Brian sounded like the little boy I remembered. Not defensive, not blaming others, simply honest. And honesty carries power, even when it's painful. Michael finally turned away from the window. His eyes were red. I owe you an apology, too, Mom. I remained silent, allowing him to continue, because sometimes people need to say difficult things without interruption. I kept telling myself I was protecting you. His voice cracked. But really, he paused, struggling, then finished. I was protecting myself. The room became quiet again, because everyone understood exactly what he meant. The mortgage, the repairs, the money, the pressure, the fear, all of it. He hadn't wanted to lose his mother. He had wanted a solution, and somewhere along the way, he had stopped seeing the difference. Daniel allowed the silence to settle. Then he spoke. There's one final matter. The room immediately tensed, because after everything already revealed, nobody knew what could possibly remain. Daniel reached into his briefcase and removed a single folder, different from the others, smaller, newer. He placed it carefully in front of me, then nodded, the signal we had arranged. This part belonged to me. I took a deep breath. My hands trembled slightly. Not from fear, from emotion, because this moment mattered. Not for revenge, not for punishment, for the future. I opened the folder. Inside were documents Robert and I had created years earlier, updated recently with Daniel's help. A long-term family trust. The room looked confused. Michael frowned. Jennifer stopped crying. Brian looked uncertain. Even Linda seemed surprised. I spoke softly. Your father and I always wanted to leave something behind. The mention of Robert immediately changed the atmosphere. Everyone loved Robert, even Linda, especially Linda, because Robert had always been the steady center of every room, the person who made everyone feel safe. I continued. For years, I planned to divide everything equally. Nobody spoke, but everyone listened. Every word mattered now. Then all of this happened. My voice remained calm, steady, stronger than I felt. And I realized something important. I looked around the room, at my children, at my granddaughter, at my sister, at the family that had nearly destroyed itself. Money doesn't build families. Nobody moved. Character does. The words landed heavily because everyone understood who they were aimed at. Not one person. All of them. Including me. I opened the trust documents. The trust still exists. Shock appeared immediately. Michael looked confused. Jennifer stared. Brian blinked repeatedly. They clearly hadn't expected that. Perhaps they thought today's meeting was about punishment, about revenge, about consequences. It wasn't. Not entirely. I continued. But there are conditions. Now everyone was paying very close attention. The room had become completely silent again. The trust is designed to help family members during genuine hardship. I paused. but not enable irresponsibility. Brian lowered his eyes. Understandably. The trust rewards accountability. Another pause. Honesty. I looked briefly toward Linda. Integrity. Nobody missed the implication. Then I turned toward Emily and smiled. For the first time all afternoon. A real smile. Because she had earned it. One person in this room chose courage when it would have been easier to stay silent. Emily immediately looked uncomfortable, exactly as I expected. She wasn't the type who enjoyed attention. The future administration of the trust will include Emily. The room froze. Emily's eyes widened. What? I laughed softly. Daniel smiled. Even Michael looked surprised. You've proven something important. Emily shook her head. I didn't do anything. You did. I looked directly at her. You protected the truth. Tears filled her eyes, not because of money, because she finally understood what I was saying. Trust. I trusted her. Perhaps more than anyone else in the room. The realization overwhelmed her. Then, something unexpected happened. Michael stood, walked across the room, and faced Emily. For a moment, nobody knew what he intended. Then he spoke. You were braver than the rest of us. Emily immediately started crying, and suddenly, something shifted. Not in the documents, not in the trust, in the family. For the first time in months, people stopped defending themselves, stopped blaming each other, stopped chasing money, stopped arguing. Instead, they started seeing the damage, the real damage, the emotional damage, the trust that had been broken, the love that had been neglected, the mother who had been invisible. And in that moment, I realized the truth had finally done its work. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Enough to expose what needed exposing. Enough to reveal who people truly were. Enough to create a chance for healing. Not a guarantee. A chance. And after everything that had happened, a chance was more than I ever expected. The meeting ended shortly after that. Not because every wound had healed, not because every problem had been solved, but because everyone was emotionally exhausted. There comes a point in certain conversations when there is simply nothing left to say. Only things left to feel, as people slowly gathered their belongings. Nobody rushed toward the door. Nobody seemed eager to leave. The atmosphere felt completely different from the countless family meetings that had come before. For months, every gathering had been about strategy, pressure, control, arguments. Now all of that had disappeared. What remained was something much harder. Reflection. Michael approached me first. His eyes were swollen from crying. I honestly couldn't remember the last time I had seen my oldest son cry. Maybe not since Robert's funeral. He sat beside me. Neither of us spoke immediately. Finally, he took a deep breath. I failed you. The words came quietly, without excuses, without explanations, without conditions. I looked at him. Really looked at him. Not the frustrated man from recent months. Not the worried homeowner. not the sun chasing solutions. I saw the little boy who used to sit beside me after bad dreams. The little boy who believed his mother could fix anything. And perhaps that had been part of the problem. For too long, I had allowed everyone to believe exactly that. I gently touched his hand. No. He looked confused. No. You made mistakes. His eyes filled again. But mistakes aren't failures unless you refuse to learn from them. The room grew quiet. Michael lowered his head. And for the first time in many months, I saw humility instead of defensiveness. A few moments later, Jennifer approached. She looked emotionally drained. The confident woman who normally managed every situation seemed completely gone. What remained was simply my daughter, vulnerable, ashamed, heartbroken. She sat across from me, then began crying almost immediately. I'm so sorry. The words came repeatedly, again and again, as though saying them enough times might somehow undo the damage. I waited until she finished, then asked a simple question. Why didn't you talk to me? Jennifer looked surprised. I continued softly. When life became difficult, when bills started piling up, when you were scared, why didn't you simply talk to me? Fresh tears appeared, because she knew the answer. I was embarrassed. The honesty broke my heart. Because embarrassment is such a lonely emotion. It convinces people they must suffer in silence. It convinces people they must hide. It convinces people that asking for help somehow makes them weak. I squeezed her hand. Being honest is never weakness. She nodded slowly. The lesson seemed to land deeper than anything else said that afternoon. Across the room, Brian sat quietly. Unlike Michael and Jennifer, he wasn't crying, but somehow he looked even more devastated. Because Brian had always carried guilt differently, silently, internally. He approached me last. His voice sounded rough. I don't know how to make this right. The vulnerability in that statement stunned me. For years, Brian had hidden behind jokes, sarcasm, optimism. Today, there was nowhere left to hide. I smiled sadly. You start by telling the truth. He frowned. What truth? The truth about your life. The room became quiet again, because everyone understood what I meant. Brian had spent years pretending things were fine, pretending business problems weren't serious, pretending debts would somehow disappear, pretending tomorrow would solve what today had created. I looked directly at him. You can't fix what you won't face. The words clearly struck something inside him. For several seconds, he simply stared at me, then slowly nodded. Perhaps for the first time, actually nodded. Not to avoid an argument, not to end a conversation, to accept responsibility. And that mattered, more than money ever could. Eventually, only a few people remained. Me, Emily, Daniel, and Linda. My sister sat alone near the far end of the conference table. Nobody seemed quite sure what to do with her. The room carried an awkward tension, because unlike the others, Linda hadn't apologized. Not really. She had cried. She had admitted the truth. But she hadn't actually apologized. And everyone noticed. including her. For a long time, she stared at the floor, then unexpectedly stood. The room immediately became still. She walked toward me slowly, almost cautiously, like someone approaching a wild animal. Or perhaps someone approaching a mirror they feared looking into. When she finally stopped in front of me, her eyes were red. "I don't expect forgiveness." The statement surprised me because it sounded genuine, not strategic, not manipulative, just honest. She continued, "I don't even know if I deserve it." Nobody interrupted. Nobody moved. Linda swallowed hard, then looked directly at me. The first time she had truly done so all day. I was terrified. Her voice trembled. The debt kept growing. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't think. Tears filled her eyes again. And every bad decision created another bad decision. I listened quietly, not because I agreed, because I understood. Fear can destroy good judgment. Fear can make decent people justify terrible choices. Fear doesn't excuse wrongdoing, but it often explains it. Linda wiped her eyes. I convinced myself I was doing what was necessary. She laughed bitterly. Amazing what people can justify when they're desperate. Nobody disagreed. The statement felt painfully true. Then came the hardest part. She looked at me and whispered, "You were the one person who kept helping me." The room fell silent, because everyone knew what she meant. The financial assistance, the debt support, the interventions, the kindness she had repaid with manipulation. Tears streamed down her face. And for the first time, I believed she fully understood what she had done. Not the financial part, the personal part, the betrayal, the trust, the damage. That realization hurt more than any dollar amount ever could. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then I stood, walked toward her, and hugged her. The room seemed stunned, especially Linda. She immediately began sobbing, the kind of uncontrollable sobbing that comes when someone has carried shame for too long. I held her quietly, not because everything was fixed, not because consequences disappeared, but because forgiveness and accountability can exist together. Robert taught me that years ago. You can love someone while still refusing to enable them. You can forgive someone while still expecting change. You can offer grace without surrendering wisdom. Eventually, Linda pulled away, still crying, still ashamed, but somehow lighter, as though speaking the truth had finally released something. When she left the conference room, nobody followed her. Nobody argued. Nobody criticized. The battle was over. Now came the rebuilding. Later that evening, Emily and I sat together on my porch. The Ohio sky glowed orange as the sun slowly disappeared. For a while, we simply watched the sunset. Then, Emily smiled. "You know something." "What?" She leaned her head against my shoulder. "They thought you were the weakest person in the family." I laughed softly. "So it seems." She shook her head. "No." Her voice carried absolute certainty. "They just didn't realize you were the strongest." I stared toward the horizon. toward the fading sunlight, toward the life Robert and I had built. And for the first time in many months, peace settled into my heart. Not because everything was perfect, because the truth was finally free. And sometimes truth is the first step toward healing, the first step toward rebuilding, the first step toward becoming a family again. 6 months later, my life looked completely different. Not because I had moved, not because I had sold my home, not because I had become wealthy overnight. The truth was much simpler. For the first time in years, I was living without carrying everyone else's weight, and that changed everything. The first snowfall of winter had arrived early that year. I stood on my porch one morning, wrapped in Robert's old coat, watching snowflakes drift across the yard. The garden slept beneath a blanket of white. The trees stood quiet and still. The world felt peaceful. For a long time, I had mistaken peace for loneliness. Now I understood the difference. Loneliness hurts. Peace heals. And after everything that had happened, healing was exactly what I needed. Inside the house, the coffee maker finished brewing. I smiled. Some habits never change. As I carried my coffee into the living room, my eyes landed on Robert's photograph. The same photograph that had witnessed every stage of this journey. The fear, the betrayal, the revelations, the truth. I picked it up. You were right. I laughed softly. I still hate admitting that. For a moment, I imagined his response. That quiet smile. That patient look. The look that always said he knew something I hadn't figured out yet. Perhaps he had known this ending all along. Not the details, but the lesson. The lesson that love without boundaries eventually becomes self-destruction. The lesson it had taken me 62 years to learn. A knock interrupted my thoughts. I already knew who it was. Emily. She visited almost every Saturday. Not because she felt obligated, because she wanted to. That difference meant everything. The moment I opened the door, she grinned. Morning, Grandma. Morning, sweetheart. She stepped inside carrying a box of pastries. Another habit. We settled into the kitchen, talking, laughing, enjoying the simple comfort of each other's company. Emily was halfway through nursing school now, confident, capable, kind. Every time I looked at her, I felt hopeful. Not because she was perfect, because she was honest. And honesty is rarer than most people realize. As we talked, another car pulled into the driveway, then another. Emily smiled. They're early. I laughed. Apparently. A few moments later, Michael and Brian entered together. The sight still felt strange. Not because they were visiting, because they were visiting without needing anything. That had become one of the biggest changes. The requests had stopped. The emergencies had stopped. The constant dependence had stopped. Not immediately, not easily, but eventually. Michael had spent the past 6 months rebuilding his finances. Actually rebuilding them. Instead of waiting for invisible solutions. The process hadn't been easy, but it had transformed him. He seemed calmer now, more grounded, more responsible. Brian had changed too, perhaps more than anyone. For the first time in his adult life, he was living within his means, budgeting, planning, accepting setbacks instead of running from them. The growth wasn't perfect, but it was real. And real growth is often messy. Jennifer arrived shortly afterward. She carried a homemade pie. A small gesture. Yet somehow it meant more than expensive gifts ever could. Because it reflected effort, thoughtfulness, love. Not obligation. Love. The relationship between Jennifer and me wasn't fully healed. Some wounds take time. But we were rebuilding. Slowly. Honestly. One conversation at a time. One visit at a time. One choice at a time. That was enough. As everyone gathered in the kitchen, I noticed something. The atmosphere felt lighter, different. Nobody was discussing my finances. Nobody was discussing my house. Nobody was discussing what should happen to my assets. Instead, they were talking about life, work, school, plans, dreams, normal things, family things. The realization filled me with quiet gratitude. Not because everything was perfect, because it was real, for the first time in a very long time. It was real. Around lunchtime, Michael pulled me aside. We stood together near the living room window. Snow continued falling outside. I wanted to tell you something. I smiled. What is it? He hesitated, then laughed nervously, the way he used to when he was young. I finally paid off the roof loan. The pride in his voice made me smile. Not because the debt was gone, because he had done it himself. No rescue, no secret intervention, no invisible safety net, just effort, responsibility, persistence, exactly what Robert always wanted for him. I hugged him, and for the first time in years, I felt pride without worry attached to it. Later that afternoon, Brian sat beside me on the couch. I got approved. For what? The business expansion. My eyebrows lifted. Really? He nodded, then smiled. The bank said my financial records actually look responsible now. We both laughed, because a year earlier, that statement would have sounded impossible. But people can change. Sometimes they simply need to stop being rescued long enough to discover their own strength. Jennifer joined us shortly afterward. She looked happier than she had in years. Healthier, too. More confident. More peaceful. I owe you something. I immediately shook my head. No. Yes. She smiled softly. I owe you honesty. The room became quiet. Jennifer looked at me, then said something I would never forget. For years, I confused your love with certainty. I frowned slightly. What do you mean? She swallowed. I thought you'd always fix everything. The truth landed heavily. Because she wasn't wrong. I had trained them to believe exactly that. Jennifer smiled sadly. When the support disappeared, I thought you'd abandoned us. Her eyes filled with tears. Now I realize you are finally giving us a chance. A chance. Not punishment. Not revenge. A chance. The distinction mattered. more than anything. That evening, after everyone left, I sat alone in the living room. The house felt quiet again, but not empty. Never empty. Because solitude and emptiness are not the same thing. I looked around the room, the photographs, the memories, the life Robert and I had built. And I thought about everything that had happened, the accusations, the betrayal, the greed, the lies, the truth, the healing, the growth. None of it had been easy. Some days had nearly broken me. Some nights I had cried myself to sleep. Some moments I had questioned everything. But standing there now, I understood something important. Strength isn't loud. Strength doesn't always win arguments. Strength doesn't always look powerful. Sometimes, strength looks like a widow sitting quietly at a kitchen table while everyone underestimates her. Sometimes, strength looks like refusing to surrender your dignity. Sometimes, strength looks like loving people enough to stop enabling them. And sometimes strength looks like finally choosing yourself. My family had spent years believing I was the weakest person in the room. The lonely widow, the aging mother, the woman who needed protection. What they eventually discovered was something entirely different. I wasn't the person they needed to save. I was the person who had been holding everything together. And once they finally understood that truth, they were forced to discover something even more important: their own strength. The strength they never needed me to carry for them. The strength that had been inside them all along. As snow continued falling outside my window, I smiled at Robert's photograph one last time. The house was quiet. My heart was peaceful. And for the first time in many years, I wasn't afraid of being alone, because I finally knew my worth. And that changed everything. Life has a way of teaching us difficult lessons when we least expect them. One of the hardest lessons is that love and sacrifice are not the same thing. Many parents spend their lives giving everything they have to their children. They work harder, worry longer, and carry burdens nobody ever sees. Often, they do it quietly because that is what love looks like. But love without boundaries can become a prison. When we constantly rescue people from the consequences of their choices, we may believe we are helping them. In reality, we may be preventing them from becoming stronger. Another lesson is that silence should never be mistaken for weakness. The strongest people are often the ones who complain the least. They are the ones carrying responsibilities nobody notices. They are the ones holding families together while receiving little recognition in return. And perhaps the most important lesson of all is this: you can forgive people without allowing them to continue hurting you. You can love people while still protecting your peace. You can be kind without surrendering your dignity. Healthy relationships require gratitude, honesty, accountability, and respect. Without those things, even the strongest family bonds can begin to break. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever been underestimated by the people you loved? Have you ever had to set boundaries with family members? Share your experience in the comments below. Your story may encourage someone else who is facing a similar situation. And if you enjoyed this journey, please like, subscribe, and join our community. Thank you for spending your time with me today. And no matter where you are in the world, remember this: Your kindness is a gift, but your peace matters too.